Hi, I'm Kristin Rawcliffe and I'm an artist and art tutor. In this video, I'm going to show you how to get started with acrylic paints. I'll talk a bit about brushes first. It's good to have a variety of brushes, a variety of shapes, sizes and quality. Here I'm using flats and rounds. The flats are the ones with the rectangular shaped ends and they're good for either thin lines or wide straight lines. The rounds are the more traditionally shaped brushes. They're round if you look down the barrel of them. And I've got small ones and large ones, but also soft ones and firm ones. Soft is good for like the finishing off layers and refining, and the firm brushes are good for expressive work or for pushing the paint into the canvas when you're first starting off. It's really quite easy to get a hold of the softer brushes. Brands like De La Rowney and Pro Arte are good. And the firm brushes I tend to get from Rosemary & Co, the Ivory Whites, or Jackson's, the Accoya Whites. I like to use synthetic brushes for acrylic, as acrylics themselves are synthetic, so, plastic with plastic kind of makes sense to me. I also use a variety of qualities because it's sometimes you can get lots of different marks with different brushes. Sometimes the cheapest brushes that are a little bit straggly can give lovely realistic marks for straggly landscape and things. So you don't always have to use expensive brushes, but it is nice to have a couple. I'm using quite a wide selection of acrylic paints here, colour-wise. Try to buy paints that are a named artist brand rather than a shop's own brand, because you'll find they're more consistent in quality. They work. Some of the cheap paints can be really streaky or watery or blobby, which can put you off painting, but actually it's the quality of your materials that's the problem and not you as an artist. So you don't have to buy the most expensive, but try and buy something that's a named artist brand. A good way to tell if your paint is good quality is if the tube is marked with its opacity. That means how transparent or opaque your paint is. When you paint with acrylic, you layer it up. So you paint one layer, then you paint another over the top to build up the depth in the painting. And it's really useful to know if the paint you're putting on is going to cover what's underneath it completely, or if some's going to show through underneath. So sometimes the opacity is marked on the tube or the bottle with a scale. Sometimes it's got a little box or circle that's filled in to show that it's opaque paint, or it's clear to show it's transparent paint. Often it's half and half to show it's semi-opaque. So to use the paints, I'm just going to squeeze them out onto a palette. You can buy all sorts of palettes. You could buy tear-off palettes or plastic palettes or palettes with holes in, or all sorts of things. But I'm just using a plain ceramic plate because it's quite easy to clean down and it's a nice size and you can see the colours quite easily on it. So today I'm going to try out the paints and the brushes and show you some exercises you can do to kind of explore your different brushes and the different paints, because it's really good to have a play when you're starting a new medium. You can't expect to go in and just start painting masterpieces. You have to have a play first and see how things work. So I've got my paints, my brushes and my palettes, and I just need to make sure I've got a jar of water, some paper towels and an apron because acrylics get messy, and then I can begin. Okay, so for the exercises that we're going to do today, I'm using a canvas board which I'm underpainting with a mid-tone colour. Canvas or canvas board is great to paint on as it's ready prepared for painting. It's been pre-primed. You could paint onto wood or board, but you'd need to give it a light sand and 3 coats of household emulsion or gesso before you painted over it. You can paint onto paper, but the problem is with paper is that it curls, so you need to stretch it first. You need to wet it and stretch it and tape it down so it dries flat, and you need to use quite heavy paper. And you'll notice that I'm using my brush to paint the strokes on in a diagonal way. First I'm going one way, then I'm going the other way, and that's really good for getting a good coverage and getting the paint into the grain. What you want to make sure is that there's no blobs or standing lumps on your underpainting, because if you have a blobby painting, it adds texture which can be distracting when you come to paint over it. It doesn't really matter too much for this because we're just doing some little exercises, but it's good practice to get that canvas primed and undercoated nice and flat. When I've finished underpainting the canvas, I'm going to wipe my brush and give it a thorough wash because you've got to be really careful about acrylic paint on your brushes. If it dries, it dries solid and it gums the bristles together and your brush is dead then really. So I do tend to sit it in water while I'm working, just in shallow water, so the metal isn't in the water, or the wood part of the brush isn't in the water, otherwise they'll get a bit wrecked. But yeah, I have to give it a really good clean afterwards to make sure that that's okay. I'm not really going to be using this brush for the actual painting itself, it's quite big, but it's the perfect size for giving the canvas a bit of a coating first. I'll need to wait for the canvas to dry before I start the exercises that I'm going to do. You should always wait for your underpainting to dry before you do the next layer. And we're just going to be testing out the different brushes that we've got to see what kind of marks they make and see how the different colours behave, because some acrylic paints are all different and some paints are opaque and some are transparent, and it's good to get to know your paints before you start working with them. The first exercise I'm going to do is trying to paint a wide smooth line with a wide flat brush to try and get it as smooth as possible at the edges without that kind of dry brush raggedy effect at the edges, which means I'm just going to have to go over it a couple of times. It's nice opaque paint that I'm using. So I'm doing the same thing again with a thinner brush. It's a flat brush again, but it's a bit softer, so I'm not getting so far up the line before the paint runs out. I can turn the brush over and use what's on the other side before I reload though. And now a thin wavy line using a short small round brush. It's quite hard to get the flow going with this. You have to sort of push and try and control it. Might be easier with longer bristles on the brush. Now I'm doing a zigzag and I'm using a flat brush so that when I use it in one direction I use the width of the brush to pull down for a thick stroke, and when I go back the other way I'm using the tip of the brush to make a thin line, so you see the same brush can make very different marks. So now I've just used the flat brush, the width of the brush and the end of the brush. I'm just using the point here to do some little dots. It's harder than you think because you've got to make sure the brush isn't overloaded and that it's got enough paint on it. And I'm trying to keep the dots even. And I'm going to do the same thing again with the same small thin brush, but this time I'm just pushing or pulling the point down a little bit more so it makes a kind of a leaf shape. Now, it's quite useful when you're doing a landscape painting, for example, to think about the marks that you can make with your brush to make the actual texture of the landscape more convincing. Just another quick example here, using a wide flat brush to make almost brick-like marks, but you can try any patterns you like really. Now I'm using a round brush to make thick and thin marks almost in a continuous line. I'm trying to control the brush and make sure I've got enough paint on my brush and not too much to try and make a nice even pattern, just by varying the pressure that I'm putting on the brush. The next I'm going to do some stippling. Stippling is a really useful technique, and it's quite good to use an old brush that's a little bit splayed or is a little bit stiff. And what I'm doing is I'm vertically dabbing the brush onto the canvas to make really rough kind of marks. And you can just carry on trying out different patterns with your different brushes, big and small, pointed, flat, fan-shaped, whatever brushes you've got. Try to think about what kind of subject your marks might fit. So it might be landscape, leaves, grasses, or it could be buildings or abstract patterns or anything really. Fill your canvas and keep on practicing. I'll be back with more tutorials soon, showing you all about blending and about layering. For more tutorials and blog posts and to see my work, visit www.untitled kristenrawcliffe.co.uk. The link's below. And let me know if you've got any more questions. And keep practicing.